How can a single quiet life, hidden in solitude, rise to confront an age collapsing into confusion and spiritual darkness? Welcome, my friend, wherever you are listening tonight. Settle into your favorite chair, breathe gently, and join our peaceful circle here. Please subscribe as we begin this quiet journey now. This is the story of Benedict, a young Roman who fled a troubled world to seek God in silence, rising through trials, miracles, and grace to shape a spiritual path whose gentle strength would guide countless souls across centuries ahead. And so, as the opening settles softly into silence, we move gently into the first steps of Benedict's earthly pilgrimage, as though following a small lamp through the early shadows of his world. Benedict was born in the hill country of Nursia, a place where valleys folded into one another like layers of an ancient garment, each carrying the whisper of winds that had traveled over Roman roads and quiet farms. His childhood unfolded in a world that still carried the proud memory of an empire. Yet underneath its familiar order ran small tremors of change, signs of a society growing weary, stretched thin by wars, invasions, and the fading of old virtues. And within this landscape, a small child was growing, watched tenderly by a noble family who hoped that learning and honor would guide his path. There was little at first to suggest that this boy, quiet and reflective, would one day become the father of Western monasticism, or that the darkness around him would only deepen as he grew. He learned the rhythm of the hills, the seasons turning with faithful simplicity, and he learned to pray with the gentle confidence children often possess, not yet weighed by the complexities of the world beyond. His parents, wishing the best for him, offered him education and the early formation expected of sons from their lineage. Yet even in those early years, it seemed as though Benedict's heart listened differently, as though some interior depth had begun to stir before he could fully understand what it meant. As he matured, the world beyond Nursia pressed more insistently at the edges of his awareness. Stories from travelers, soldiers, and traders brought news of Rome's unrest. Moral confusion, political intrigues, decaying institutions, and the exhaustion of a once mighty power were all slowly threading themselves into daily life, even in distant towns. Benedict, still very young, watched how adults spoke in hushed tones about the changes they did not know how to stop. And perhaps it was this early exposure to an unraveling world that began shaping the foundations of his future choice. A yearning for something purer, something steadier than the fragile structures around him. Yet he had no vision of the life that awaited him. He simply felt, even as a boy, that God was close, and that the movements of the heart were often more revealing than the movements of armies. When he was sent to Rome for studies, it was because his parents imagined a bright future for him, perhaps a public office, or a learned profession that would contribute to the reordering of society. Education in Rome was an honor and a promise, and Benedict's natural intelligence made him a fitting candidate for deeper learning. Still, as the time approached, he felt a quiet, unspoken reluctance. He loved study, yes, but something in him feared what he would encounter in the great city. In that era, the Rome of his youth was not the Rome of the early Caesars, nor the Rome of classical virtue. It was a place wounded by invasions, shaken by political instability, weighed down by crowds who brought both hope and turmoil as they searched for meaning amidst the shifting ground of their times. But expectations guided him, and he obeyed, trusting that whatever awaited him would somehow fit into the larger design he could not yet perceive. The journey from Nursia to Rome marked the first decisive turning of his life, though he did not know it then. The long roads stretched before him with their ancient stones polished by centuries of travelers. And as he walked, he felt something like sorrow and anticipation mingling in the depths of his chest. Each village he passed, each quiet chapel, each open field seemed to whisper its own invitation to pause, to remain, to root himself in silence. yet he remained faithful to the path he was given. If he wondered why the world seemed so restless, why his heart was so drawn to the margins rather than the center, he kept his thoughts within, offering them to God in the simple prayers he whispered each night. But the Rome he finally entered was even more troubled than the stories had suggested. Crowded streets overflowed with noise, tension, and a kind of spiritual fatigue that felt heavy on the air. The astonishing beauty of old structures stood beside signs of poverty and unrest, while young men seeking pleasure or influence wandered with a desperation that was easy to sense but difficult to name. For Benedict, arriving with the innocence of a provincial youth, the contrast between the noble ideals he had grown up with and the chaotic reality before him struck deeply. The city, once the center of the world, now seemed like a place searching for a soul it had misplaced long ago. And though he dutifully immersed himself in his studies, an unease began to take root, as though something within him whispered that he could not remain in such a place without losing a part of himself, meant for God alone. Night after night, he watched his fellow students chase distraction and indulgence as though they feared the quiet. He heard laughter that carried no joy and arguments that settled nothing. He saw ambition, pettiness, and a deep hunger that no earthly pleasure seemed able to satisfy. And slowly, gently, Benedict began to understand that the collapse of Rome was not merely political or military, it was spiritual. A people who forget who they are cannot hold their world together. A civilization that loses its interior light cannot sustain its outward glory. This realization brought him no pride, only a deep ache and a longing for a different way of living, a way that honored God in simplicity and holiness. But how could he find such a path in a place where noise drowned even the faintest whisper of the heart? He began to withdraw quietly from distractions, choosing solitude when he could, praying more often, and searching for guidance in Scripture. The quiet spaces of his student lodging became a kind of early hermitage, small and imperfect, but filled with the yearning of a soul learning to listen. He did not judge those around him. He simply felt that he could not share their pursuits without betraying something sacred within himself. And so, a subtle but firm resolve began forming. He would leave Rome. He would step away from a world that could not nourish the seed of holiness God was planting in him. But the decision was not simple. Walking away meant disappointing his family, abandoning the path they had envisioned, and embracing an unknown future. Yet sometimes, God guides not by clarity, but by longing, and Benedict felt that longing strengthening with each passing day. The more he prayed, the more certain he became that his soul could not breathe in Rome's air. Eventually, the quiet resolve crystallized. He would leave, not out of fear, but out of fidelity, to God, to truth, to the hope that somewhere beyond Rome's walls he would find the silence necessary for grace to shape him. And so, with a heart more full of trust than certainty, he began preparing for a departure that would change not only his life, but eventually the life of the entire Western world. He did not know where he would go. He only knew he must go. And with that first interior yes, his journey into holiness truly began, like the faintest flame resisting a gathering night, glowing softly against the currents of history. And as the light of this first chapter gently dims, we pause and wonder, what does a young heart seek when the world around it loses its way? And so, as Benedict steps quietly beyond the fading lights of his childhood and the first tremors of Rome's unrest, we follow him into the next movement of his journey, like travelers walking beside a young pilgrim who has just taken his first brave step away from the familiar and toward a destiny still hidden from his sight. When Benedict first entered Rome as a young student, he carried with him the silent hopes of his family and the expectations of a society that believed education could still steady the teetering pillars of a once mighty world. Yet the Rome he discovered was not the Rome of statues and philosophers, nor the Rome that had shaped the ancient stories whispered through the hills of Nursia. Instead, it was a city fraying at every edge, a place where the weight of the past and the confusion of the present pressed together so tightly that one could almost feel the tension in the air. Benedict walked the long, crowded streets with wide, observing eyes, taking in the shouts of merchants, the stumbling of drunken youths, the anxious whispers of citizens who sensed that the old order was slipping through their fingers. This was the Rome of late antiquity, a city bruised by invasions and political instability, confused by the mingling of old customs and new beliefs, and burdened by a spiritual hunger that countless small distractions could not calm. And into this atmosphere walked a young man who longed not for power or pleasure, but for clarity, for truth, for a way of living that aligned the soul with God. At first, he tried to immerse himself in what had been planned for him. He attended lessons, studied literature and law, and listened to teachers who spoke of rhetoric, politics, and the shaping of society. But every day, as he walked home through the noisy streets or sat alone in his room trying to study, he felt an interior fatigue pressing gently but persistently against his heart. It was not the exhaustion of hard study, but the deeper weariness that comes when one's surroundings do not nourish the soul. Rome was a place overflowing with people, noise, and urgency, yet strangely empty of the peace Benedict craved. He saw young men his age spending their nights in reckless indulgence, trying to forget their anxieties through ritual entertainments or fleeting pleasures. He saw corruption among officials, moral confusion even among the educated, and a kind of disorientation that made him feel as though the city had lost its center. Each time he returned to his room in the evening, the noise of the city still echoing faintly in his ears, he felt a longing for something quieter, purer, more steadfast. There were moments when he wandered into the old basilicas, drawn by the flicker of oil lamps and the scent of incense hanging gently in the stillness. There, surrounded by silence and the soft glow of sacred spaces, he felt the ache in his heart ease. The prayers of the faithful, whispered or spoken softly, rose like gentle breath, and he sensed that God's presence lingered most clearly where noise fell away. He would sit in the quiet, watching the dance of candlelight against stone, and wonder why peace was so easy to find within the walls of prayer, but so difficult to find beyond them. The contrast grew stronger each day, and little by little, he began to understand that Rome's moral collapse was not simply an external crisis, but a reflection of countless interior struggles. If a city of such history and grandeur could lose its grounding, what hope did individuals have unless they rooted themselves in something far deeper than the shifting structures of society? Although Benedict rarely spoke of his discomfort aloud, those who observed him closely noticed that his demeanor was different from that of the other students. He was not drawn to the raucous laughter echoing through taverns, nor the competitive boasting of young men eager to prove themselves. Instead, he sought solitude whenever he could, choosing corners of courtyards where he could read quietly, or rising early to walk through the city while the streets were still cool and hushed. On these walks, he often found himself contemplating the lives of the saints, the early hermits, and the martyrs whose stories he had heard as a child. They too had lived through troubled times. They too had faced worlds that seemed darkened by confusion and sin. What had they discovered that allowed them to endure with joy, with hope, with steadfast faith? And what might he be called to discover? One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills and cast its warm glow across the city, Benedict found himself returning from his lessons with a heaviness he could no longer ignore. The noise of the streets seemed sharper, the laughter of intoxicated revelers more hollow, the conversations around him more filled with despair than he had realized before. It was as though the city's unrest had finally revealed itself fully to him. That night, Lying awake in the dim light of his lodging, he felt a quiet but unmistakable prompting stirring within his heart. It was not a voice or a sudden vision, but rather a gentle certainty, the kind that arises when the soul is finally ready to accept truths it has long resisted acknowledging. He knew that if he remained in Rome, the noise would drown out the voice of God speaking to him. He knew that he could not become the man he hoped to be in a place that pulled him constantly toward distractions and temptations. And so, he realized he must leave. Yet leaving Rome meant stepping into uncertainty. It meant surrendering the future his parents had imagined for him, surrendering the comfort of knowing what the next day would bring. It meant trusting that the interior pull he felt was truly from God and not merely a reaction to discomfort. But Benedict had learned to listen to the movements of his heart, and he sensed that this prompting carried the unmistakable clarity of grace. And so he decided to act quietly, without fanfare, without trying to convince anyone. He would leave the city, not in rebellion, but in humility, seeking a place where silence could teach him what Rome could not. When he finally stepped beyond Rome's walls, he carried little with him. He was not fleeing in fear, but moving toward a deeper truth. He walked with the simplicity of a pilgrim, trusting that God would guide him through valleys and hills, through uncertainty and hope, toward the place where his soul could breathe again. As he left behind the city's crumbling grandeur, he felt both sorrow and relief, as though he were closing a door he had once hoped would lead him to a meaningful future, yet sensing that a different door, one far more hidden, had opened quietly within him. Benedict walked toward solitude, toward silence, toward the unknown path God was preparing. With each mile he placed behind him, the noise of Rome faded and the quiet invitation of grace grew stronger. And though he did not yet know where he would finally rest, he knew this: the world he left behind could no longer shape him, and the world ahead, though hidden, held the seeds of a life that would one day reshape Christendom itself. And so this part of his story settles into stillness, leaving us to wonder gently. When a soul can no longer breathe in its surroundings, where does God lead it next? And as Benedict leaves behind the echoing noise of Rome and steps into the quiet vastness of the countryside, the journey before him unfolds like a long, untraveled road, where every step carries him farther from what he has known and closer to what God will reveal, if only he listens with a patient heart. Benedict did not know exactly where he was going when he left Rome. He simply knew he must walk away from the crowded avenues, the crumbling foundations, and the voices that had pulled him in too many directions. The great city had become like a heavy cloak he could no longer carry, and with every mile he placed behind him, he felt a gentle unburdening, as though the air around him grew clearer and the landscape more capable of receiving the stirrings of his soul. The paths he followed wound through quiet hills and valleys, still touched by the rural life of early Italy. Here, farmers tilled the soil with a steady rhythm. Shepherds tended their flocks with the patience of generations, and the pace of life seemed governed not by ambition, but by the rising and setting of the sun. It was in these open spaces, far from the crowded avenues of Rome, that Benedict first tasted a freedom he had only sensed from afar, a freedom born not of escape, but of turning inward, of listening to the silent movement of God's presence, drawing him into deeper silence. As he journeyed, he spent long hours contemplating the world he had left behind. He thought of Rome's grandeur and its fragility, of its beauty and its wounds, and of the countless people who searched endlessly for meaning in pursuits that could never satisfy. Softly, he wondered whether any soul could remain healthy in a world that had so profoundly forgotten how to be still. Benedict himself had not been immune to temptation. He'd felt the pull of distraction, the whisper of ambition, the subtle tug of comfort. And perhaps it was precisely this vulnerability that allowed him to see with clarity the spiritual hunger hidden beneath Rome's outward unrest. The quiet of the countryside now seemed like a mercy, a chance to breathe, to pray, to let go of the noise that had clouded his heart. Yet even as he embraced the silence, he sensed that his journey had only begun, and that solitude itself would soon ask of him a deeper and more difficult surrender. Eventually, Benedict reached a small village called Defied, where he paused for a time. There he met a few people who were struck by his humble demeanor and the innocence of his features. His presence seemed different, touched by a seriousness and a sweetness that was rare for someone so young. It was in Defied that he formed a quiet friendship with a holy man named Romanus, a monk who lived in a nearby monastery. Romanus saw in Benedict something precious, a soul longing for God with a sincerity that was both fearless and tender. He listened as Benedict described his discomfort with Rome's distractions and his search for a place where he could give his whole heart to prayer. Romanus recognized the unmistakable stirring of a vocation that could not be satisfied by half measures, and gently, with the wisdom of one who understood the cost of such choices, he offered Benedict guidance without pressure, encouragement without expectation, and brotherly love without condition. It was Romanus who ultimately revealed to Benedict the presence of a hidden cave in the mountains of Subiaco, a place where solitude embraced the earth like a quiet womb, and where silence had lingered for so many generations that it seemed almost a living companion. Located high above the valley, reached only by narrow paths and rugged slopes, the cave had long been a refuge for those who sought God away from the noise of the world. Romanus understood that Benedict's heart was being drawn into a deeper solitude than he could find in any village or monastery at that moment, and with gentle encouragement, he guided him toward the life that awaited him there. Benedict accepted Romanus's direction with gratitude and humility, sensing that this hidden place among the rocks might finally offer the stillness he had been yearning for. And so, with little more than the clothes he wore and the trust he carried within him, he followed Romanus's guidance to the mountain path. Each step upward felt like a step inward, a gradual shedding of whatever remained from his former life. The wind brushed against him as he climbed, carrying with it the scent of pines and the faint call of distant birds. When at last he reached the entrance of the cave, he felt something like recognition, as though he had been searching for this place long before he knew it existed. The cave's opening, dark and simple, did not frighten him. Instead, it welcomed him with a quiet solemnity, as though inviting him into the heart of the mystery that had been silently preparing him for this very moment. Inside, the space was small and cool, carved by nature into a hollow that held silence as gently as a chalice holds water. The stone walls felt ancient, and the darkness seemed less like emptiness and more like a soft, enveloping veil. Romanus, knowing the hardships Benedict would face in such solitude, promised to bring him bread and necessities in secret, lowering them by rope from above so that no one would discover the young hermit's presence. With this arrangement made, Benedict entered the cave alone, taking with him nothing but the desire to belong wholly to God. The days that followed were unlike anything Benedict had known. Solitude at first felt like a gift, a soothing balm that calmed the restless movements of his heart. He prayed, he listened, he let the silence shape him. But as time passed, solitude became a teacher that demanded courage. The quiet exposed his weaknesses, his fears, his temptations. The mind, no longer occupied by the noise of the world, turned inward, revealing thoughts he had never faced before. Benedict battled loneliness, discouragement, and the subtle temptations that often rise when the soul is stripped of distractions. There were moments when he doubted himself, moments when the darkness of the cave mirrored the shadows within his own heart. Yet he did not flee. He learned to kneel in the midst of spiritual struggle, to trust that grace was working even in the silence, and to let God's presence anchor him amid the storms that arose unseen. One particularly fierce temptation struck him with such force that he feared for his spiritual survival. The memory of an old desire stirred within him with a violence that shocked him, threatening to pull him back into the world he had left behind. In desperation, he fled the cave, climbed the harsh slope outside, and threw himself into a thorn bush, letting the pain purify his heart and break the temptation's hold. It was an act born not of despair, but of fierce fidelity to God, a willingness to endure physical suffering to preserve the purity of his soul. And when at last the temptation subsided, Benedict returned to his cave transformed, strengthened by grace, and more deeply rooted in his purpose than ever before. As seasons passed, the young hermit grew in holiness unseen by the world. His hair lengthened, his clothing grew worn, but his eyes shone with a gentle clarity born of communion with God. Romanus continued to care for him quietly, and Benedict's hidden life became a silent offering poured out in the heart of a world that desperately needed the light he was nurturing. He had become, without fully realizing it, a small flame burning in a secluded corner of the earth, a flame that would one day kindle a fire far greater than he could imagine. And as this chapter rests softly into the quiet of the cave, we pause and ask, what does a soul discover when the world finally falls silent and God alone remains? And so, as Benedict surrenders himself to the deep quiet of the mountain cave, hidden from every distraction and from every path he once knew, we continue with him into a solitude that is no longer merely a place, but a shaping fire, a slow and sacred schooling in the ways of God. Life in the cave at Subiaco soon became a steady rhythm for Benedict, though it was a rhythm unlike anything he had known before. Days and nights seemed to blend into each other in a gentle, contemplative flow, marked not by the bells of a monastery or the noise of a bustling world, but by the subtle shifts of light that entered through the cave's opening and the quiet sound of Romanus's rope lowering provisions from above. It was here, in this simple dwelling, that Benedict discovered a dimension of the spiritual life he had only sensed during his years in Rome, the profound truth that silence is not emptiness, but presence, and that solitude is not isolation, but invitation. The cave became a sanctuary carved by God's own hand, a place where the noise of the world could no longer reach him, and where the delicate movements of grace found a heart ready to listen. At first, the silence was gentle, like a soft cloth laid across his shoulders after a long, weary journey. He prayed with the earnestness of youth, pouring out his thoughts without restraint, grateful to breathe freely after the suffocating noise of Rome. He marveled at the stillness, at the way the faintest whisper seemed to linger like incense hanging in the air. He read a few scraps of scripture that Romanus gave him, meditating slowly, allowing each line to settle into his soul as though it were seed falling into rich soil. These early days were filled with gratitude, wonder, and a sense of discovery. It felt as though God had cleared a vast interior space within him, and he walked through that newfound space with a quiet joy. But solitude is a teacher who reveals her lessons gradually and with unwavering honesty. As the weeks turned into months and the months stretched toward years, the silence took on a deeper tone. It began to reveal to Benedict not only the presence of God, but the hidden corners of his own heart. The cave, with its cool darkness, became a mirror that reflected not only peace, but every imperfection, every unresolved longing, every subtle temptation that he had carried within him. At times, the silence felt like a companion. At other times, like a force pressing upon him with a weight that tested his endurance. There were long stretches when loneliness settled over him like a heavy mantle, when the absence of human voices felt like a hunger that could not be satisfied. And yet, Benedict learned to remain, trusting that endurance in solitude was a path toward spiritual clarity and not a descent into emptiness. During the cold seasons when frost clung to the stones outside and the wind moaned through the crevices of the mountains, the cave felt especially austere, Hunger was frequent, comfort was scarce, and the darkness lingered long after sunset. At times, Benedict's body trembled from cold or weakness, but he offered these sufferings to God with the simplicity of one who understood that sacrifice was a form of love. Romanus's quiet visits provided what little physical support he received, but the deeper sustenance came from prayer, from the simplicity of being alone with God, from the trust that every trial was shaping him for something not yet revealed. There were mornings when Benedict would wake before dawn and sit at the cave's entrance, watching the sky slowly brighten over the valley. The silence in those early hours felt like a promise, a reminder that each new day was a gift given to souls who listened. Yet the road of solitude is never free from temptation. One day, a powerful and sudden temptation swept over Benedict with such intensity that he feared he might lose the interior purity he had worked so hard to preserve. It was a temptation of memory, born from an old image that had slept quietly in the recesses of his mind until it rose with startling force. For a moment, the cave's darkness seemed suffocating, and Benedict felt his soul shaking under the weight of the struggle. He fled into the open air, running until he reached a thorn bush. There, in a moment of desperate fidelity, he cast himself upon its sharp branches, letting the pain break the grip of temptation and restore his heart to peace. This act did not stem from self-hatred, but from the fierce love that drove him to protect the solitude God had given him. When he returned to his cave, scratched and bleeding, he felt a profound calm wash over him, as though the struggle had opened a new depth of grace within him. Over time, something remarkable began to happen. The solitude that had once challenged him now became his dwelling place of joy. The silence he had wrestled with now opened into prayer so deep that it no longer felt like speaking to God, but resting in him. His thoughts slowed, his senses softened, and his heart grew tender to the movement of the Spirit. The cave had become not simply a shelter, but a womb, a place where grace slowly reshaped him, where virtues took root like small shoots that would one day grow into a towering tree. Benedict discovered the sweetness of humility, the freedom of purity, the strength of obedience, and the quiet courage that comes from trusting God in all things. He no longer longed for Rome or for the life he had been expected to pursue. His heart was content with God alone. As the years passed, the shepherds who wandered through the mountains began to notice the hermit who lived hidden in the cave. There was something unexplainable about him, a serenity, a radiance, a gentleness that seemed to flow naturally from his presence. Word of the holy young man living in solitude spread quietly from one villager to another. People began to seek him out, not out of curiosity, but out of a deep sense that he carried a peace they desperately needed. They climbed the rugged paths with questions, sorrows, and hopes, and each time they left, they carried with them a comfort that lingered long after the descent back into the valley. Romanus, who had guided Benedict to this life of hidden sanctity, watched with humble joy as the young hermit's holiness began softly touching the lives around him. Benedict himself remained unaware of the influence he was beginning to exert. He simply prayed, listened, and welcomed those whom God brought to him with the generosity of a heart shaped in solitude. He never sought followers, yet God was preparing him to become a father to many. What he learned in the cave, the discipline of silence, the strength found in humility, the clarity born of prayer, would one day form the foundation of a spiritual movement far beyond anything he could imagine. The cave at Subiaco, dark and quiet, had become a cradle of grace, a hidden workshop where God shaped a soul destined to guide generations. Benedict's solitude was no longer a retreat, but a preparation, and the mountain that had sheltered him would soon become the first step into a life that would illuminate an age darkened by uncertainty. And as this chapter closes its gentle circle, we pause for a moment and wonder, When grace begins its hidden work in a soul, how long before the world begins to notice the quiet light that grows there? And so, as Benedict's years of hidden solitude unfold in the quiet cradle of the mountain cave, we move gently with him into a new season, one in which the holiness he never sought to display begins to shine outward in ways he never intended, drawing others toward the silent fire that has been kindled within him by grace alone. With time, the cave at Subiaco, once known only to Benedict and to Romanus, became the resting place of a presence that others could feel long before they saw him. Shepherds who passed along the narrow mountain paths began to notice something unusual, a peace in the air, a stillness deeper than silence, a sense that the rocks themselves held a quiet reverence. It was as if nature, which had embraced Benedict's hidden life for years, now carried within it a faint glow that stirred the hearts of those who approached. At first, the shepherds saw only small signs, a bit of smoke rising from a fire, footprints near the cave, or a cloak hung carefully on a ledge to dry. But soon rumors drifted down into the valley. There is a holy man living in the mountain, someone who prays through the night, someone whose presence brings peace. These whispers spread not through fanfare or curiosity, but through gentle gratitude, like a light warming the corners of a dimming world. Those who first approached him did so cautiously, uncertain whether he would welcome their presence or vanish deeper into the wilderness to avoid attention. But Benedict, though he cherished solitude, never turned away a soul in need. When shepherds arrived seeking counsel or prayer, he received them with quiet hospitality, offering no grand teachings or long speeches, only gentle words shaped by the stillness of prayer. His voice carried a calmness that made even the troubled breathe more slowly. His gaze held kindness without judgment. For those who were weary, his presence felt like a balm. And so, one by one, the simple people of the valley grew to love him, not as a spectacle, not as a figure to be admired from afar, but as a friend who lifted their burdens in silence. It was not long before local villagers joined the shepherds in seeking Benedict. The world below was changing swiftly, marked by uncertainty and fear as the old order of society continued to crumble. People longed for someone who could speak to the human heart with truth and gentleness, someone who could remind them that God had not abandoned them even as the world around them seemed to crack and sway. And perhaps without realizing it, Benedict became that reminder. He listened to those who came, prayed for their families, blessed their children, and gently guided them toward hope. Many who met him returned to their homes feeling renewed, carrying stories of a young hermit whose holiness was like a quiet flame in a darkening age. Romanus watched these developments with a mixture of joy and humility. He had seen the potential within Benedict from the beginning, and now he saw how the grace that had shaped the young hermit was beginning to radiate outward. Yet Romanus also sensed that Benedict's solitude was reaching its natural end. God had hidden him in the cave for the time necessary to root his soul deeply in prayer, but holiness, once matured, rarely remains alone. It seeks to lift others, to guide, to form, to build. Romanus knew that Benedict's hidden years were preparing him for a larger purpose, one that could not unfold if he continued to live entirely in secrecy. The turning point came one spring morning when a group of local monks from a nearby community made the journey to Benedict's cave. Their community had fallen into internal disorder, weakened by disputes and moral laxity. They were in desperate need of a leader who could restore discipline and charity among them. Hearing of the young hermit's sanctity, they ascended the mountain and found Benedict sitting near the entrance of the cave, praying quietly as the morning sun warmed the stones. They approached with humility, and with a trembling sincerity they asked him to become their abbot. Benedict listened, his heart troubled. He had fled the world to escape its chaos. Now the world was seeking him out for guidance. The thought of leaving his cave, of returning to communal life, filled him with uncertainty. And yet he also sensed that refusing this call might be an act of self-protection rather than obedience. He asked for time to pray. For hours he knelt in silence, feeling the weight of the decision. He cherished solitude, yet he knew that solitude must never become an idol. God's will often leads the heart beyond comfort and into sacrifice. After prayer, Benedict accepted the task, not out of ambition, but out of humble readiness to serve. When he joined the community, the monks initially rejoiced, but Benedict's approach to leadership soon revealed a discipline they had not expected. His rule was simple yet firm, his expectations rooted in charity but grounded in truth. He believed that a monastery should be a place where every moment, whether of prayer, work, or rest, was consecrated to God. For Benedict, holiness was not a matter of dramatic gestures, but of steady fidelity. But the monks, accustomed to leniency and disorder, soon found this new discipline burdensome. They had wanted a holy man, but not a holy life. They had asked for a guide, but not a transformation. As Benedict's reforms began to take shape, resistance grew. Some monks grumbled quietly, others complained openly. A few, whose hearts had grown hardened, saw Benedict not as a spiritual father, but as an obstacle to their comfort. Their resentment grew until it became something darker, something dangerous. One day, during a meal, they presented Benedict with a cup of wine that had been poisoned. They watched as he lifted it to bless it, perhaps expecting him to say the words quickly and drink without noticing. But Benedict paused. A sense of danger stirred within him, the quiet prompting of the Holy Spirit. He made the sign of the cross over the cup, and as his fingers completed the blessing, the cup shattered as though struck by an invisible force, its contents spilling harmlessly onto the floor. The monks stared in silence, stunned by the miracle. Benedict looked at them not with anger, but with sorrow. He understood that he could not remain as their abbot. God had protected him, but he would not force holiness upon unwilling hearts. With gentle firmness, he left the community and returned to the solitude from which he had been called. This departure was not a failure. It was a revelation. God had more work for Benedict, work that required a community ready to receive the gift of his leadership. Back at Subiaco, the news of the miracle spread quietly among the people. Shepherds, villagers, and travelers spoke of the poisoned cup that broke in Benedict's hands. They saw in him not just a holy hermit, but a man chosen by God, protected by his power, guided by his spirit. And as the story spread, more people sought him, not out of curiosity, but out of trust, a trust that would soon lead Benedict into the greatest chapter of his life, the founding of communities shaped not by disorder, but by peace, not by indulgence, but by prayer, not by fear, but by the grace of God. And as this part of his journey settles gently into reflection, we pause and ask, when holiness emerges from hidden places, what new paths begin to open before those who are willing to follow its quiet light? And so, as Benedict leaves behind the fractured community that could not yet bear the weight of the discipline he offered, we follow him gently back into the valleys and hills of Subiaco, where God is quietly preparing the next unfolding of his vocation, a chapter shaped not by rejection, but by a deeper and more enduring purpose. When Benedict returned to the solitude of Subiaco after the shattering of the poisoned cup, he did not carry bitterness in his heart. He carried only a quiet sadness, a gentle sorrow for souls that longed for God but resisted the structure that would help them find him. He had not sought leadership, and he did not cling to it when it became clear that his presence brought division rather than growth. Instead, he stepped back into the silence with the humility of one who knew that God's path often winds in unexpected ways. The cave that had once sheltered him welcomed him again, as though embracing him after a long journey, and Benedict resumed the rhythm of prayer and contemplation that had first shaped his spirit. Yet this time his solitude felt different. He had tasted the challenge of guiding others, felt the weight of their expectations, and experienced the sting of betrayal. But he had also seen God shatter a cup of poison in his hands, a sign that divine protection rested upon him in ways he had not previously imagined. The solitude he returned to was no longer the solitude of a novice. It was the solitude of a man whom God was forming for a mission beyond his imagining. Not long after his return, people began coming to him in greater numbers than before. The story of the poisoned cup had spread quietly through the region, passed from shepherd to traveler, from mother to neighbor, from monk to villager. Some came seeking protection from spiritual darkness. Others sought guidance for their lives. Still others came hoping simply to feel the peace that seemed to surround Benedict like a cloak woven of prayer. And Benedict welcomed each one with the same gentleness that had characterized him since his youth. He offered counsel without judgment, prayer without haste, and love without condition. His holiness was not severe or distant. It was tender, steady, and profoundly human. People left his presence feeling lighter, as though he had taken their worries and offered them to God with such purity that the burdens dissolved. It was during this time that young men began seeking him out, not just for counsel, but for companionship in the spiritual life. They desired to learn from him, to live near him, to share in the rhythm of prayer and work that had shaped his soul in the silence of the cave. At first, Benedict hesitated. He knew the responsibility of guiding others was heavy, and he still carried the memory of how poorly prepared some communities were to embrace true holiness. But as these seekers continued to gather, he discerned that God was indeed calling him to form something new, something different from the fragile communities of the past. These young men did not approach Benedict out of convenience or desperation. They came out of genuine longing for a life of discipline, stability, and prayer. They came seeking God, and Benedict could not turn away those who sought God sincerely. So he began, gently and slowly, to gather them. Not into one large community at first, but into several small groups, each centered around prayer, study, manual labor, and charity. In the valley and at the edges of the mountains, Benedict established small clusters of monks, 12 communities in all. Each had its own dwelling place, simple and rustic, close enough to be united in spirit, yet far enough to foster the quiet needed for deep prayer. For these communities, Benedict devised a structure rooted in the principles that had shaped his own journey: humility, obedience, moderation, and continual awareness of God's presence. He did not want monasteries that were rigid or harsh. He wanted places where souls could grow as steadily as plants, nourished by sunlight and water. He wanted homes of peace where prayer was not a performance, but a breath, where work was not drudgery but offering, where silence was not emptiness but communion. As these communities took root, a new spirit began to settle over the region. Fields that had once lain neglected were cultivated with care. The sound of prayer rose gently from small chapels at dawn and dusk. Travelers who passed through noticed the difference immediately. There was order where disorder had once reigned, harmony where bitterness had taken root, and a profound stillness that seemed to bless the surrounding countryside. Benedict moved among the communities as a loving father, visiting each one regularly, offering counsel, resolving disputes, and reminding the monks with gentle firmness that the purpose of their life was union with God. He taught them that holiness was not achieved through dramatic feats or severe penances, but through small acts of fidelity, faithful prayer, honest work, mutual love, and a willingness to place God's will above one's own desires. Yet even in this time of growth, Benedict's path was not free from opposition. Among the many who admired him, one man in particular viewed Benedict with a heart clouded by envy. His name was Florentius, a priest who lived nearby. At first, Florentius simply felt irritated by Benedict's rising reputation, offended by the quiet admiration others held for the holy abbot. But irritation soon bloomed into envy, and envy into resentment. Florentius feared that Benedict's influence would overshadow his own, and he began seeking ways to disrupt the peace of the communities. He spread rumors, stirred suspicion, and sought opportunities to undermine Benedict's work. When these efforts failed, Florentius resorted to more direct interference. He sent women to tempt the monks and cause scandal. He encouraged local troublemakers to disrupt the daily rhythms of the monasteries. His malice did not come from principle, but from fear, the fear that another's holiness exposed his own lack of sincerity. Benedict, however, responded not with anger, but with sorrow. He understood the fragile nature of a heart consumed by envy, and rather than confront Florentius, he prayed for him fervently. But as Florentius's hostility grew more aggressive, Benedict faced a decision. He knew that his presence, though guided by love, was intensifying Florentius's bitterness and endangering the peace he hoped to cultivate. And so, with deep humility, Benedict once again chose to withdraw, not because he feared Florentius, but because he wished to preserve peace for the communities God had entrusted to him. He gathered his monks, blessed them, and entrusted their care to leaders he had prepared. Then, with quiet dignity, he departed from Subiaco, allowing God to lead him onward to the next chapter of his purpose. Not long after he left, a stone balcony collapsed under Florentius as he watched Benedict's departure, and he was killed instantly. The monks sent word to Benedict, believing the priest's death was divine justice and urging him to return. But Benedict gently refused. He did not rejoice in any man's downfall. His mission lay elsewhere now. God was guiding him toward a place where his influence would take deeper root, a place where he would build not just communities, but a vision of monastic life that would shape centuries. That place was Monte Cassino. And as this chapter settles into stillness, we pause and ask, when opposition closes one door, what new path does God quietly begin to open before the soul that continues to trust him? And so, as Benedict turns his back gently on Subiaco, leaving behind the valleys where grace first shaped his hidden years, we walk with him now toward a new mountain rising in the distance, Monte Cassino, where his life will unfold not in secret anymore, but in a quiet radiance that will endure long after his earthly pilgrimage is complete. Monte Cassino rose above the surrounding landscape like a sentinel, ancient and weathered, carrying within its stones the memories of centuries. Before Benedict ever stepped upon its slopes, the mountain had known other voices, other prayers, some belonging to pagans who once offered sacrifices on its heights, others to farmers who sought favor for their crops, and still others to wanderers who climbed its rugged paths, seeking something they could not name. When Benedict first approached the mountain, he saw that its summit still held the ruins of a temple dedicated to Apollo. Broken columns, scattered stones, and the remnants of old altars lay exposed beneath the open sky. The people who lived around the mountain still clung to old practices, unsure of what gods to trust in an age shaken by disorder and fear. Benedict saw all of this with a heart that had been softened by years of solitude, disciplined by trials, and shaped by grace. And he understood without any dramatic revelation that this was where God was asking him to begin again. The climb to the summit was long and steep, yet with each step Benedict felt a growing warmth in his spirit, a sense that the mountain itself had been waiting for him. When he reached the top, he stood among the broken stones and let the wind wash over him. The air was clear, the sky expansive, and the ruins beneath his feet spoke of humanity's forgotten longing for the divine. Benedict did not despise the remnants of pagan worship. He saw in them the echoes of hearts searching for truth. And so his first act upon the mountain was not one of anger or destruction, but of gentle reclamation. He blessed the ground, prayed for the souls who had once worshipped there, and asked God to make this place a dwelling of light. Then, with the steadiness that had guided him through every previous chapter of his journey, he began to build. The first structure Benedict raised was a small chapel dedicated to Saint John the Baptist, the herald of conversion, the voice crying out in the wilderness. The choice was deliberate. Benedict understood that those who came to Monte Cassino would need to be called to a new life, to turn away from confusion and back toward God. Next, he established simple dwellings for the monks who would gather around him. These structures were fashioned from stone and timber, built with the help of the very people who lived on the mountain slopes. They brought wood, offered their hands, and found themselves unexpectedly drawn into the rhythm of the growing community. As the monastery began to take shape, something within the local population began to shift. Seeing Benedict's simplicity, his gentleness, and the peace that seemed to radiate from him, many grew curious. Why had this man chosen their mountain? What did he see here that they could not? Benedict answered not with arguments, but with love. He welcomed the villagers who approached, spoke to them with kindness, and prayed for their families. He taught them not through stern lectures, but through the example of a life centered entirely on God. Gradually, the people who once clung to the old rituals found themselves letting go of the practices that had long lost their meaning. They listened to Benedict's words about Christ, about mercy, about the hope that never abandons the weary. They watched the monks work with joy, pray with serenity, and live in harmony. And little by little, Monte Cassino became not merely a monastery, but a beacon, a place where transformation was not forced, but invited, where faith was not demanded, but awakened. Benedict organized the community with the steady hand of one who had learned the cost of disorder and the beauty of balance. He taught his monks that prayer should not overwhelm work, nor should work overshadow prayer. Both were paths to God. The hours of the day were divided with gentle precision, times for worship, times for study, times for labor, times for rest. The monks cultivated gardens, tended vineyards, copied manuscripts, welcomed travelers, and served the poor. Benedict reminded them often that Christ could be found in every act of charity, in every duty done with love, in every moment offered with humility. Holiness was not reserved for the extraordinary. It was woven delicately into the fabric of daily life. As the monastery flourished, the spiritual influence of Benedict deepened. People from distant towns began climbing the mountains seeking his wisdom. They brought burdens heavy with sorrow, confusion, or guilt. Some came with questions about faith, others with wounds they could not heal on their own. Benedict listened to them all with a patience formed in solitude and strengthened by suffering. He did not give long discourses. He offered short, heartfelt words, shaped by the clarity of prayer. And these words, carried by the wind or remembered in the quiet of night, changed lives. It was during these years at Monte Cassino that Benedict began to witness an increasing number of spiritual battles, moments when darkness sought to disrupt the harmony of the monastery or to harm him personally. One night, as he prayed alone, a loud crash echoed through the building. A boulder had been hurled at the monastery's walls by unseen hands. Another time, a brother woke Benedict in distress, reporting that he had seen a dark figure prowling near the chapel. Yet, through every disturbance, Benedict remained calm. He understood that where grace flourishes, evil often stirs in agitation, not with power, but with the desperation of one losing ground. Benedict answered each spiritual challenge with prayer, fasting, and the sign of the cross. And each time, the darkness receded like a shadow fleeing from dawn. But it was another threat, one carried not by spirits but by human envy, that gave rise to one of the most tender and miraculous episodes of Benedict's life. Among the many who watched the monastery's growth was a man who despised Benedict's influence and feared the spread of his teachings. This man, fueled by resentment, sent Benedict a loaf of bread laced with deadly poison. When the bread arrived at the monastery, Benedict sensed immediately that something was wrong. The loaf appeared ordinary, but the prompting within his heart was unmistakable. He called for his faithful companion, a raven that often visited him, a creature he had fed and spoken to with the affection of one who saw God in all creation. Holding the loaf in his hands, Benedict spoke softly to the raven and showed it the bread. He then instructed the bird to carry the loaf far away into the wilderness, to a place where no living creature would be harmed. The raven understood. It took the poisoned loaf in its beak, flapped its wings, and soared into the sky, disappearing beyond the trees. Later, it returned to Benedict's side, dropping its head as if seeking a blessing. Benedict stroked its feathers gently and thanked God for using even a humble creature to preserve his life. The monks who witnessed this miracle were moved deeply, not by the spectacle, but by the tenderness with which Benedict interacted with creation. It was clear that holiness had made his heart expansive enough to include even the smallest beings in his care. As Monte Cassino grew in spiritual strength, Benedict's reputation as a wise and loving abbot spread widely. But the monastery was not built merely for the present. Beneath every decision he made, Benedict carried a vision of a life lived for God, with balance, harmony, and joy. A vision that would one day take form in the rule he would write. A vision that would guide countless souls across centuries of turmoil and renewal. But for now, he simply lived each day with the quiet fidelity that had always marked him, letting God shape the path without haste, without fear, without ambition. And as this chapter ends like a soft breeze settling over the mountain, we pause and wonder gently, when a soul becomes a dwelling place of peace, how far can that peace travel into a world longing for light? And so, as Monte Cassino settles into its steady rhythm of prayer and labor, and Benedict's quiet miracles become woven into the memory of those who climb the mountain seeking hope, we move now into a season where the work of his hands expands gently outward, forming not only a monastery but a living pattern of holiness that will soon take root far beyond the stones he has laid. Life at Monte Cassino began to unfold like a slow dawn. The monastery, once a simple cluster of buildings, gradually grew into a community that pulsed with quiet devotion. Monks rose before the first hint of daylight, gathering in the chapel as darkness still clung to the mountain. Their voices, soft and unhurried, rose in prayer like mist lifting from the earth. After prayer came work, tending the gardens, repairing walls, copying texts, greeting travelers, each task approached not as a burden, but as an offering. Benedict walked among them with a calm, measured grace, guiding without pressing, teaching without preaching, shaping the hearts of his monks with the same patience a gardener uses with fragile seedlings. Under his care, the monastic life at Monte Cassino took on a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing, and as enduring as the stones that anchored the monastery to the mountain. But while the community grew in peace, the world below remained troubled. News of conflicts, uncertainties, and upheavals filtered up the mountain with each traveler who visited. Rome still struggled with political instability. Regions that had once been firmly under imperial rule now lay vulnerable to invasions and shifts in power. And yet, amid these storms, the monasteries Benedict had founded became places of refuge, not necessarily from physical danger, but from the spiritual disorientation that afflicted so many hearts. Travelers came seeking wisdom, stability, or simply a respite from the burdens they carried. They found within the walls of Monte Cassino a sanctuary where time seemed to move differently, where the noise of the world softened, and where the presence of God felt close enough to touch. As more monks joined the community, Benedict gradually entrusted leadership of various tasks to those who had proven faithful and steady. He believed deeply in the value of obedience, not as blind submission, but as a loving acceptance of one's place within a greater whole. In his eyes, every monk, whether skilled or unskilled, strong or frail, had a role given by God, and each role was essential in its own way. Work was not to be avoided, nor was prayer to be treated as an escape from labor. Rather, the two must balance one another, like wings that together allow the soul to rise. When the monks laid stones, they prayed. When they prayed, they worked inwardly. Benedict understood that the soul thrives not in extremes, but in harmony, in the steady hum of a life anchored in purpose. It was during this time of growth and harmony that Benedict began forming the early ideas that would later become the rule. He observed the needs of the monks, their struggles, their joys, their temptations, their strengths, and he began to realize that monastic life required not only a loving father, but a clear guide. A community needed direction just as a traveler needs a lamp. Without structure, zeal could become chaos. Without compassion, discipline could harden into coldness. Benedict's experience at Subiaco had taught him that holiness must be nurtured gently, with consistency and wisdom. So he watched, prayed, and listened. He learned from his monks as much as they learned from him. And as the seasons passed, the tender shoots of insight grew into sturdy branches of conviction. Meanwhile, Monte Cassino became known not only as a place of prayer, but as a place of learning. Benedict encouraged the monks to copy manuscripts, scripture, sacred writings, and even works of early scholars, so that knowledge might be preserved in a world increasingly threatened by turmoil. He believed that the mind, like the soul, must be fed. And so, within the quiet walls, the monks created a treasury of wisdom that would one day become a lifeline for generations who lived long after the empire's final collapse. Yet the monks did not view their work as an achievement. They simply obeyed Benedict's guidance, unaware that they were becoming guardians of memory for an age yet to come. But holiness, as it deepens, often stirs a quiet trembling in the shadows. While Benedict built his community with gentleness and patience, there were forces, spiritual, human, and environmental, that sought to disrupt the harmony forming on the mountain. Some disturbances were subtle, like a sense of unease that settled over a novice during prayer, or a sudden impulse toward disobedience that seemed to rise from nowhere. Other disturbances were more visible. One evening, as the monks gathered for supper, a gust of wind swept through the hall with such sudden force that the lamps flickered violently, and the shadows on the walls trembled as though disturbed by an unseen presence. Another time, a stone pillar cracked unexpectedly during a storm, sending fragments tumbling across the courtyard. The monks whispered among themselves, wondering if these events were more than natural occurrences. Benedict remained calm. He taught the monks not to fear disturbances, but to strengthen their prayer, for spiritual trials often intensified just before a new grace unfolded. He reminded them that the enemy of the soul often becomes restless when holiness takes root. The monks listened, reassured by his composure, and continued their daily rhythm with renewed devotion. And indeed, the disturbances soon softened, like brief storms passing through a tranquil sky. Yet the most striking moment of disruption during this period was neither violent nor loud. It came from a small, unexpected corner of creation. At a time when the monastery's gardens were flourishing and the monks were preparing their harvest, a strange heaviness fell over the community, not of sorrow, but of fatigue. The younger monks struggled to rise for prayer, and even the older ones found their concentration wavering. Benedict sensed that this was not an ordinary weariness. He prayed, asking God to reveal the source of the disruption. And in time, it became clear that the presence of wild animals near the monastery, especially wolves and boars, had unsettled the fields and frightened the novices, who were still learning to quiet their hearts during work and prayer. Benedict's response was simple and tender. He walked alone into the fields near dusk, when the sky glowed with fading light, and lifted his hands in prayer. Nature quieted around him. The rustling of animals grew still, and in that quiet he prayed not only for safety, but for harmony, that creation might dwell at peace with those who sought to serve God on the mountain. the disturbances gradually ceased. The wild creatures no longer approached the monastery grounds. It was as though an unseen boundary had been drawn. The monks, unaware of the depth of Benedict's prayer, simply found their hearts lightening again and their fatigue dissolving. The monastery continued to flourish. Visitors came more frequently. Some sought healing, knowing that the touch of Benedict's hands brought relief to the suffering. Others brought news of families torn by grief or of young men who longed to join the monastery. Benedict welcomed each visitor with humility, offering what he could and entrusting the rest to God. More than once he foretold events that later came true, not out of a desire to astonish, but because his heart, attuned to God's movements, could sense the paths unfolding ahead. These moments only deepened the monk's love for him, though Benedict remained careful never to draw attention to himself. He wanted the focus always to be on God, not on the vessel through which God sometimes chose to work. And through all of this, the first shape of the rule slowly formed within Benedict's mind. He observed, he prayed, he listened, he allowed time and grace to refine each insight. The rule would not be written yet, but its spirit breathed through the halls of Monte Cassino, shaping hearts long before it took the form of words. And as this chapter draws to its gentle close, we pause softly and wonder, how does a simple life, lived faithfully on a quiet mountain, begin weaving threads that will one day stretch across centuries? And so, as the quiet life of Monte Cassino settles into its steady heartbeat of prayer and work, and the early breath of the rule continues to take shape within Benedict's soul, we journey now into a chapter touched by both grace and shadow, a time when the light growing upon the mountain draws the eyes of many, some with admiration and some with the troubled restlessness of envy. Life at Monte Cassino did not unfold without trials, even as peace deepened among the monks who lived under Benedict's gentle guidance. For while holiness attracts those who seek God, it also unsettles those whose hearts are conflicted. Among the many who heard of Benedict's work, there was a priest living not far from the mountain, a man outwardly devoted to faith, yet inwardly troubled by a quiet but persistent envy. His name was Florentius. At first, he regarded Benedict with mild irritation, dismissing the stories of miracles and wisdom as exaggerated praise from people easily impressed by novelty. But as Benedict's reputation grew, as more villagers and travelers climbed the mountain, seeking the counsel of the quiet abbot, Florentius felt something within him tightening, shrinking, resisting. He feared that his own influence would diminish, that the respect he once received would be overshadowed by the affection people bore toward the gentle monk at Monte Cassino. And envy, once it finds fertile ground in a heart, rarely remains small. It grows, quietly at first, then urgently, seeking ways to justify itself. The first signs of Florentius's unrest appeared through subtle gestures. He began warning villagers against trusting Benedict too readily. He hinted that the monks might be misguided, too severe, or dangerously influential. These whispers, though quietly spoken, carried an energy that troubled some hearts. Yet the villagers who knew Benedict's kindness felt no confusion. They brushed aside Florentius's insinuations, gently but firmly, recognizing them for what they were, echoes of a heart wrestling with its own shadows. When this early attempt failed to diminish Benedict's influence, Florentius's envy deepened, mingling now with fear. What if Benedict's work transformed the entire region? What if people began turning to the monastery instead of to him? These questions gnawed at him, not because Benedict had ever shown pride or ambition, but because Florentius felt his own inadequacy reflected painfully in Benedict's serenity. And so, Florentius moved from whispers to direct interference. He attempted, through subtle provocations, to stir unrest among the monks. He sent young women to linger near the monastery's fields, hoping to distract or tempt the brothers. He encouraged local troublemakers to disrupt the monks at work, shouting near the fields or making noise during prayer. Yet each time, Benedict responded not with anger, but with calm perseverance. He instructed his monks to continue their tasks with patience, to treat disturbances as opportunities for charity, and to remember that spiritual growth often comes not through ease but through endurance. The monks obeyed, and the peace of Monte Cassino held firm. But Florentius, unable to accept the failure of his schemes, escalated his efforts. One day he sent Benedict a loaf of bread laced with poison, hoping that the quiet abbot, whose love embraced even the smallest creatures, would bless the gift without suspicion and thus succumb to its deadly purpose. But as soon as the loaf was set before him, Benedict felt a deep stirring of intuition, a quiet warning from God. He lifted the bread, examined it, and sensed that it carried more than nourishment. It carried harm. Meanwhile, Monte Cassino became known not only as a place of prayer, but as a place of learning. Benedict encouraged the monks to copy manuscripts, scripture, sacred writings, and even works of early scholars, so that knowledge might be preserved in a world increasingly threatened by turmoil. He believed that the mind, like the soul, must be fed. And so, within the quiet walls, the monks created a treasury of wisdom that would one day become a lifeline for generations who lived long after the empire's final collapse. Yet the monks did not view their work as an achievement. They simply obeyed Benedict's guidance, unaware that they were becoming guardians of memory for an age yet to come. But holiness, as it deepens, often stirs a quiet trembling in the shadows. While Benedict built his community with gentleness and patience, there were forces, spiritual, human, and environmental, that sought to disrupt the harmony forming on the mountain. The symbols represented not just superstition, but a direct challenge to the purity of their devotion. Yet Benedict, though deeply saddened, did not allow fear to take root. He gathered the monks, blessed the statues with holy water, and instructed that they be removed and destroyed. He prayed for Florentius with genuine sorrow, asking God to touch the priest's heart with the grace he resisted so fiercely. Still, he began to understand something deeper. Florentius's struggle was no longer a passing envy. It had become a torment, a spiritual illness threatening both the priest and the peace of the monastery. Benedict knew that holiness must never become a cause of stumbling for another soul. And so, with the humility that had defined every chapter of his life, he made a decision that astonished the monks. He told them he would leave Monte Cassino temporarily to remove himself as the source of Florentius's agitation. This was not a retreat from conflict, but an act of mercy. He believed that by stepping aside, Florentius might find room to breathe, to turn inward, and perhaps, one day, to repent of the turmoil that had overtaken him. The monks pleaded with him not to go. They had grown to love him as a father, a shepherd, and a guide. But Benedict, with gentle firmness, reminded them that their strength did not come from him, but from God. And so he prepared to depart. The morning he left, the community surrounded him with tearful reverence. He blessed them, reminding them to remain steadfast in their prayer and charity, and assuring them that the foundation they had built together was strong enough to endure his absence. But God, who sees beyond every human attempt to hinder his work, allowed an unexpected event to unfold. Not long after Benedict's departure, while Florentius stood on a balcony watching the monks below, the structure beneath him suddenly gave way. The balcony collapsed, and Florentius plunged to his death. The monks, upon hearing the news, sent a message to Benedict urging him to return. They saw the sudden collapse as divine justice, a sign that the obstacle standing in the way of Benedict's work had been removed. Yet Benedict did not rejoice. He did not triumph. His heart, shaped by mercy, grieved for Florentius's soul. He refused to return immediately, not out of fear, but because he felt deep sorrow that envy had claimed such an end. Benedict withdrew for a brief time of prayer, entrusting Florentius to the boundless mercy of God. And when he finally returned to Monte Cassino, he did so not with triumph, but with humility, stepping again into the rhythm of prayer and work, determined to heal any lingering wounds with gentleness. His monks welcomed him with relief and quiet joy, understanding now more than ever the depth of his compassion. It was perhaps this chapter, formed by conflict, patience, and sorrow, that most deeply shaped what would come next: the writing of the Rule, a guide not born from theory but from lived experience, forged in trials, softened by mercy, and illuminated by grace. And as this chapter settles into a soft hush, we pause and ask, what wisdom grows in a heart that chooses peace even when wrongly accused, and chooses mercy even when wounded? And so, as Benedict returns once more to Monte Cassino, with a heart tempered by trials and softened by mercy, the quiet rhythm of the monastery gathers around him, again like a familiar cloak, and we move now into a chapter where the work of his spirit deepens, where stones give way to sanctuaries, and where the earliest breath of the Rule begins to take clear, steady form within his soul. When Benedict stepped again onto the familiar paths leading toward the summit of Monte Cassino, the mountain greeted him as an old friend. The wind moved gently through the grasses, the stones felt warm beneath the midday sun, and the brothers who had awaited his return looked upon him with a love that was almost reverent. They had endured the turmoil caused by Florentius with patience, strengthening one another through prayer and work, and now they saw in Benedict's face the radiance of a father who had walked through sorrow yet returned without bitterness. He carried no trace of triumph, no shadow of resentment, only a deeper serenity, a stillness that spoke of grace refined by suffering. And as he reached the monastery gates, the monks bowed not out of formality, but from the tenderness of sons greeting a beloved parent. Life resumed with new vigor. Benedict's presence, always steady and gentle, now carried an added depth, as though his soul had widened to hold both the light of peace and the memory of trials overcome. He set himself once again to the daily rhythm of guiding the monks, praying with them in the chapel, working beside them in the fields, instructing them in humility, charity, and obedience. But there was something unfolding within him that even the monks did not yet fully understand. His experiences, the solitude of the cave at Subiaco, the failed attempt at leading an undisciplined community, the miracles that had protected his life, the months of quiet formation at Monte Cassino, and the sorrowful conflict with Florentius, all of it had been shaping a new clarity, a vision of monastic life that transcended any individual moment. Slowly, quietly, the Rule began to whisper itself into his heart. But before the Rule could be written, the monastery itself needed to be completed. The structures built in the early years were simple, shelters assembled quickly so the monks could begin their life of prayer. Now Benedict envisioned something more stable, more enduring, a monastery that would stand not just for the present generation, but for many yet to come. He saw Monte Cassino not merely as a gathering of dwellings, but as a school of the Lord's service, a place where souls could be shaped into instruments of peace, where prayer and work would rise like incense to heaven, where the presence of God would be felt in every corridor, every courtyard, every gesture of charity. Thus the work of building began anew. The monks labored with joy, hauling stones, carving beams, preparing mortar. There was no division between sacred and ordinary tasks. Every act carried the dignity of offering. As Benedict moved among them, his presence seemed to transform even the most tiring labor into something contemplative. He would pause beside a brother who struggled with heavy stones, offering a few words of encouragement that somehow made the burden lighter. He blessed the foundations of each building, praying that the walls would become a shelter for souls seeking God's mercy. The chapel was the first structure he rebuilt with lasting care. He knew that the monastery's heart must be its place of worship, its quiet sanctuary where the monks would gather day and night to praise God. When the walls rose, the brothers decorated them with simple yet reverent designs, crosses, vines, and symbols of resurrection. The altar stone was placed with solemn prayer, Benedict asking that every sacrifice offered upon it would renew the hearts of those who knelt before it. Outside the chapel, the monastery grew steadily. Dormitories for the monks, a refectory where they would share their meals in silence while scripture was read aloud, workshops for crafts and copying manuscripts, guest quarters for pilgrims seeking rest, and gardens whose beauty reflected the order and peace that Benedict cherished. Fruit trees were planted, their blossoms a sign of hope. Vegetable gardens shed fragrance in the sun. Paths lined with stones guided the monks from prayer to labor and from labor back to prayer, a gentle reminder that both movements belong to the same rhythm of holiness. As the monastery flourished, the local people once again became part of its life. They brought baskets of grain, jugs of wine, wool for the monks' habits, and stories of illnesses, disputes, or sorrows that needed Benedict's wisdom. Benedict welcomed them all. He taught them gently, healed some with prayer, reconciled feuding families, and offered comfort to those burdened by grief. Many came not seeking miracles, but seeking the peace that seemed to flow from the monastery like a quiet stream. Children climbed the path carrying small gifts, cones, flowers, wild berries, simply because they felt drawn to Benedict's warmth. And though he often returned to the solitude of his cell to pray, he received each visitor with the tenderness of a shepherd who never forgets the voice of even the smallest lamb. Yet even as the monastery thrived and the region found new harmony through Benedict's presence, the world beyond remained turbulent. The Roman Empire was fading into history, its borders eroding, its institutions crumbling. Invaders moved through weakened territories, famine struck certain regions, and rumors of wars spread with each traveler who passed by. People feared what the future might hold. But atop Monte Cassino, a different kind of stability was being born, a stability rooted not in political power, but in spiritual endurance, a sanctuary where the values of charity, humility, order, and devotion could flourish even as kingdoms rose and fell. It was in this context, amid the fractures of a world losing its cohesion, that Benedict completed the rule. He wrote not with haste, nor with the desire to impose a rigid system, but with the patience of a father shaping a guide for his children. Each chapter flowed from lived experience, the need for moderation, the beauty of silence, the power of obedience, the dignity of work, the importance of hospitality, the humility that must anchor every heart, and the centrality of Christ in every act. The rule did not demand greatness. It invited faithfulness. It did not glorify heroic deeds. It honored perseverance. It did not seek brilliance or perfection. It sought hearts willing to surrender daily to God's love. And though Benedict did not yet know how widely his rule would spread, he sensed that it carried something not merely for Monte Cassino, but for the world beyond. The rule was a gift, light carved from years of darkness, clarity born from seasons of trial, order born from chaos, tenderness forged in solitude. It was a lamp for a world groping through uncertainty, a compass for souls searching for direction. And so, Monte Cassino became the cradle not only of a monastery, but of a vision, one that would soon ripple outward, carried quietly by monks who understood that the life shaped on that mountain was not meant to remain there alone. And as we gently draw this chapter to a close, we pause and wonder, when God plants a seed of peace upon a mountain, how far might its roots reach, and how many hearts might someday rest in its shade? And so, as Monte Cassino stands steadfast upon its height, shaped by Benedict's patient hands and softened by the prayers of his growing community, we move now into a chapter where the rule he has written begins to breathe beyond parchment, taking form in the hearts of men, transforming daily life into a quiet, holy journey whose echoes will linger across centuries. When the rule was finally completed, it did not arrive with fanfare or formal ceremony. Benedict did not gather the monks in the chapel to announce it, nor did he present it as a triumph or great achievement. Instead, he carried the handwritten pages in his arms with the tenderness of a man holding something fragile and precious, a gift entrusted to him by God. He shared it first with the brothers closest to him, handing it to them quietly, inviting them to read it slowly and prayerfully. They took the manuscript with reverence, not yet fully aware of its significance. But as the monks read its pages, each line shaped by Benedict's lived experience, each instruction tempered by years of prayer and trial, their hearts stirred. The rule was not a philosophical treatise or a set of rigid decrees. It was a map of the heart, drawn by one who had learned the terrain through tears, solitude, miracles, and grace. Word spread gently among the community that their father and abbot had written a guide unlike any they had ever seen. Soon the rule was read aloud in the refectory during meals, discussed in whispers between brothers tending the fields, pondered in cells as the lamps burned low. Its teachings were simple and clear, that prayer should be steady, not grand, that work should be honest, not hurried, that humility was the foundation of every virtue, that obedience was not subservience, but a willing surrender to the voice of God spoken through community, that charity should govern every interaction, that silence should be cherished, that moderation was wiser than extremes, that hospitality was a sacred duty, and that Christ should be recognized in every guest, every task, every moment. The monks embraced the rule with a sense of relief, as though their inner longing for guidance had finally found language. Some were moved by the chapters on humility, recognizing in Benedict's words the quiet strength they had always admired in him. Others were drawn to the sections on prayer, discovering that the rule offered a pathway into the stillness they had struggled to find. Younger monks found comfort in its structure, grateful for the gentle boundaries that helped them resist distractions. Older monks found that the rule refined what they had already learned, deepening their devotion with new clarity. And through it all, Benedict moved among them with the same quiet humility that had shaped the rule itself. He never claimed to be its author. He spoke of it only as something God had placed into his heart, something meant to do good far beyond what he himself could ever accomplish. Life at Monte Cassino changed subtly as the rule took root. The hours of the day, once ordered by necessity and instinct, now flowed with sacred purpose. Before dawn, the monks gathered for prayer, their chants rising through the darkness like a warm, steady flame. As the sun climbed, they moved into their tasks, caring for the sick, feeding travelers, cultivating the fields, copying manuscripts, practicing crafts. Silence embraced them, not as a restriction but as an intimate friend, helping them hear the faint movements of God. Each brother knew his place, not because he was forced into it, but because the rule taught that the strength of community rests in the harmony of its parts, the willingness of each soul to give what he can and to accept what he cannot. Visitors who came to the monastery during this time often remarked on the peace that seemed to blanket the entire place. Some felt it as soon as they stepped through the gates. Others felt it gradually, like a warm tide rising around them. It was not simply that the monks prayed often. It was that everything they did, even the smallest task, seemed touched by prayer. Benedict understood that holiness was not something that happened occasionally, but something woven into each breath. He wanted his monks to live as though Christ walked beside them always, in the fields, in the workshops, in the kitchen, in the chapel, and in the quiet corridors at night. And slowly, that vision began to shape the hearts of the brothers until it became the air they breathed. Though the monastery flourished, Benedict himself never allowed comfort to settle too deeply into his life. He continued to fast with moderation, to pray long into the night, to walk alone among the stones when the moon rose above the mountain. He prayed for his monks with a father's heart, offering their struggles to God, begging grace for those who faltered, giving thanks for those who persevered. He sensed that spiritual battles still lingered at the edges of the monastery, waiting for moments of weakness, and so he remained vigilant, not out of fear but out of love, guarding his community with prayer as steadfastly as others might guard their homes with walls. It was during these years that Benedict's gift of discernment deepened. He began to foresee events that had not yet occurred, sometimes small matters, sometimes profound. There were moments when a monk approached him with distress, seeking counsel, and Benedict spoke with a clarity that revealed a truth the monk had not confessed. Other times, when a troubled traveler climbed the mountain seeking guidance, Benedict spoke words that pierced through confusion and sorrow, offering comfort that felt divinely timed. These moments were not dramatic miracles, but quiet unveilings, signs that God had drawn Benedict's heart close enough to his own that he could sense the subtle movements of grace and temptation in others. Yet not all of Benedict's miracles were hidden. One afternoon, as the monks labored in the fields, a young brother approached Benedict in tears. His iron tool, essential for the work of the day, had fallen into the deep waters of a nearby lake. Losing it meant losing hours of necessary labor, and the young monk felt the weight of responsibility pressing upon him. Benedict walked to the water's edge with him, took the wooden handle from the monk's trembling hands, and prayed briefly. Then he lowered the handle toward the surface, and to the astonishment of all present, the iron head of the tool rose from the depths, attached itself to the handle, and emerged as though drawn by an invisible hand. The monk wept with gratitude, not because the tool had been restored, but because Benedict's tenderness reassured him that God cared even for the smallest worries of his children. As Benedict's reputation for holiness grew, so too did the number of visitors seeking healing. Some arrived with physical ailments, others with spiritual wounds too deep for words. Benedict met each one with the same quiet gaze and gentle touch. He prayed, sometimes silently, sometimes with brief invocations, and more often than not, peace settled over the one before him like a soft cloak. There were those who left healed. There were those who left strengthened enough to carry their suffering with new grace, and there were those who simply left knowing they had been loved. Amid this growing impact, Benedict's personal humility remained untouched. He wrote none of his miracles down. He spoke of his experiences only when necessary to guide others. He sought no recognition, no elevation, no earthly honor. His only desire was that God's will be done in him and through him, whatever that will might be. And so, the rule settled deeply into the life of Monte Cassino. It guided the rising and setting of the monks' days, shaped their work and their prayer, softened their hearts, and strengthened their purpose. They did not know, and Benedict did not imagine, that this rule would one day travel far beyond their mountain, forming the foundation of monastic life across Europe, preserving knowledge through centuries of turmoil, and becoming one of the quiet pillars upon which Western civilization would rest. And as this chapter ends like a deep breath taken in the peace of dusk, we pause and wonder, when a life is offered wholly to God, how far can the ripples of that offering reach across the fragile landscape of time? And so, as the rule settles like a gentle foundation beneath the feet of the brothers, shaping each hour with purpose and bathing each task in quiet devotion, we enter now into one of the most luminous chapters of Benedict's life. Years touched by miracles, visited by trials, and marked by a spiritual fatherhood that carried countless souls through darkness into light. The monastery at Monte Cassino had by now become a living sanctuary, not through wealth or brilliance, but through the steady hum of prayer and the gentle discipline of the rule. From dawn to dusk, The monks moved through their days with a kind of peaceful cadence, like waves lifting and falling upon a quiet shore. They prayed the psalms with voices that rose softly through the mountain air, tilled the soil with hands strengthened by faith, and welcomed guests with hospitality that made even strangers feel as if they had returned home. Yet behind this tranquility was a man whose heart never ceased to intercede for them, Benedict, whose deep communion with God continued to broaden, deepen, and reveal itself in ways both visible and hidden. Over time, the miracles surrounding Benedict became more frequent, yet none of them bore the flair of spectacle. They were quiet, almost shy, like the gentle unfolding of dawn. Often, they manifested through discernment. A monk approaching Benedict with a troubled expression did not need to force the words from his lips. Benedict spoke gently before the brother could even begin, naming the struggle with a clarity that seemed impossible for a man who had not heard the confession aloud. When he guided the monks, he often sensed temptations they had not yet identified, warning them with fatherly tenderness and helping them avoid snares that might have taken months or years to see on their own. But there were moments when grace revealed itself more plainly. One afternoon, a visitor from a nearby village arrived at the monastery in deep distress. His servant, a young boy, had fallen gravely ill, slipping into a sleep that seemed too deep to be natural. The man knelt before Benedict in desperation, begging for prayer. Benedict listened with compassion, placed his hand gently upon the man's trembling shoulder, and assured him that God's mercy would not abandon those who sought him with sincere hearts. Later that evening, Benedict retired to prayer, lifting the boy's name before God. And as he prayed, he felt an unexpected lightness, a sense of interior peace that often followed petitions God had already chosen to answer. The next day, the man returned with tears in his eyes. The boy had awakened in the night, free of fever, speaking clearly as if the illness had been no more than a passing dream. Benedict offered no dramatic acknowledgement. He simply thanked God, as if the miracle were as natural as sunrise. Not all miracles appeared through healing. Some came through protection. One night, as the monks slept, a violent wind swept across the mountain, rattling doors and shaking the wooden beams of the monastery. A massive boulder, loosened somewhere along the upper cliffs, tumbled downward with great force. Had its path continued unimpeded, it would have struck the dormitory where the brothers slept, causing devastation beyond measure. But the rock, moments before reaching the building, veered sharply and broke apart, scattering into harmless fragments. The monks awoke to the commotion and discovered the shattered pieces at their doorstep. Benedict simply bowed his head in prayer, sensing with quiet certainty that divine protection had turned the stone aside. There were also miracles of provision. During a season when heavy rains damaged the crops and threatened famine, the monastery's food stores ran dangerously low. The monks, though frightened, trusted Benedict's calm assurance that God would provide. And indeed, just when their stores reached the brink of emptiness, a group of travelers arrived with carts full of grain. They explained that they had felt compelled by a voice, a dream, or a sudden impulse they could not name to bring the grain to the mountain. They had no knowledge of the monastery's need, but God knew. Benedict thanked them with a hospitality so warm that it kindled new faith in the travelers' hearts. Yet among all the miracles that blossomed around him, there were also darker moments, battles not with flesh and blood, but with spiritual forces that sought to disturb the peace of Monte Cassino. Benedict sensed these attacks not through visions or dramatic signs, but through subtle shifts, a heaviness that fell upon the community during prayer, a whisper of discouragement that spread among the monks, or sudden temptations that struck without warning. But the rule had prepared the brothers for these storms. They strengthened their prayer, increased their vigilance, and relied upon the rhythm of their life together to anchor them. Benedict taught them that the enemy trembles at unity, flees from humility, and cannot withstand perseverance born of love. And so, even in these moments, peace ultimately prevailed. One of the most poignant miracles came through Benedict's deep compassion for a monk named Maurice. Maurice was known for his obedience and gentle spirit, and Benedict loved him as a son. One day, a young monk named Placidus went to draw water from the lake at the foot of the mountain. As he leaned forward, the ground beneath him gave way, and he fell into the deep water. Maurice, hearing cries of alarm, ran to Benedict, who immediately sent him to rescue the drowning brother. Maurice obeyed without hesitation. In his urgency, he ran across the water's surface as though it were solid ground, reached Placidus, and pulled him safely to shore. Only when he returned did he realize what had occurred. Maurice trembled, overwhelmed by the miracle worked through his obedience. Benedict, with humility, attributed the miracle to Maurice's faith. Maurice attributed it to Benedict's holiness. And Placidus, still wet from the lake, quietly said that he had seen Benedict's presence beside him in the water, guiding Maurice step by step. As the years continued, Benedict's gifts of foresight grew even stronger. He foretold famine in a nearby region and instructed the monks to prepare extra food for the needy. When the famine struck, the monastery became a refuge, its stores miraculously lasting far longer than reason allowed. He foresaw the arrival of dangerous visitors and warned the monks to receive them with caution. He predicted the outcome of disputes brought before him, always with the intention of bringing peace rather than asserting authority. Yet through all these moments, miracles, wonders, and signs, Benedict remained profoundly human. He wept with those who suffered. He rejoiced with those who found healing. He worried for the monks who faltered. He prayed through the night for those who carried hidden burdens. And when his own heart felt heavy or weary, he walked among the stones of Monte Cassino, letting the quiet of the mountain restore his spirit. He always returned to one simple truth, that all things begin and end in the love of God. It was during this time that Monte Cassino became known far beyond its region. Travelers carried stories of the holy man on the mountain. Young men seeking purpose journeyed for days to join the community. Even leaders and nobles sent word, asking for Benedict's counsel. But though the world began to look toward him, Benedict's gaze remained fixed upward and inward, toward Christ, the silent companion of his long pilgrimage. And so, miracles, whether hidden or seen, became woven into the life of Monte Cassino as naturally as the rising of the sun or the lighting of lamps at dusk, not as spectacles but as gentle reminders of God's nearness, love, and continual care. And as this chapter's light softens like the glow of candles in a quiet chapel, we pause and wonder, what happens to a world when a single heart, purified through trials, becomes a window through which God's mercy shines without obstruction? And so, as the miracles surrounding Benedict continue to unfold with the same calm, unassuming grace that marks every step of his journey, we enter now into a chapter where his spiritual fatherhood deepens, where visions and warnings guide those under his care, and where the mountain becomes not only a sanctuary of peace, but a stage upon which the hidden movements of God and the stirring shadows of the world begin to meet. The years following the miracles of Maurice and Placidus were among the most spiritually radiant of Benedict's life. His monastery flourished, not with grandeur or riches, but with the quiet strength of souls steadily learning to surrender themselves to God's will. Yet alongside this flourishing came a growing awareness that Benedict's communion with God was drawing him deeper into mysteries that few around him could fully grasp. Some of these mysteries arrived as gentle insights, movements of the heart that guided him in helping a troubled monk or warning the community before danger arose. Others appeared in visions, unexpected glimpses of events far beyond the monastery walls. And still others came as interior whispers, small lights illuminating the winding paths of human souls. One evening, as dusk settled over Monte Cassino and the monks gathered for the chanting of Vespers, Benedict paused suddenly during prayer. His eyes, though lifted toward the Psalter, seemed to gaze through it into a horizon no one else could see. After the service ended, he remained kneeling long after the brothers had returned to their evening tasks. Something within him felt heavy, not with fear, but with sorrow. A sorrow that came from knowing he had witnessed a truth he could not yet speak aloud. That night, he confided the vision only to a few trusted companions. He had seen, in the clarity of an inner light, the destruction of Monte Cassino. The monastery that had grown under his hands, the community that had become his spiritual family, would one day be attacked, burned, dismantled. The stones they had laid, the gardens they had planted, the chapel where their voices rose in prayer, all would be overturned. Yet Benedict did not weep for the loss of buildings. He wept only for the suffering of his monks. And even in his sorrow, he spoke with peace. He told the few brothers who heard this vision that nothing built for God is ever truly lost, that destruction in time cannot erase the good done in eternity. He assured them that God's providence would remain even when storms arrived that they could not prevent. And though he never shared the vision widely, the few monks who knew of it carried a quiet reverence in their hearts, sensing that their abbot walked with God more intimately than they could ever comprehend. In time, long after Benedict's death, the prophecy would come to pass exactly as he had seen it. But for now, it remained one of many interior burdens he carried silently. Such visions were not rare in these years. Benedict often perceived the moral and spiritual condition of people far from him. One story that became widely known involved a nobleman who had made a vow of holiness but soon fell into deep temptation. Though the man lived many miles from the monastery, Benedict saw in a vision the moment when the nobleman was nearly ensnared by grave sin. Immediately, he sent 2 monks to visit him, instructing them to travel quickly and offer counsel. When they arrived, they found the nobleman in the very situation Benedict had foreseen, trembling with shame and relief. Their presence saved him from falling further, and the nobleman later confessed that he had felt a sudden, unexplainable pull toward repentance at the exact moment Benedict had prayed for him. Such stories, whispered from traveler to traveler, began spreading far beyond Monte Cassino, reaching distant villages and cities, drawing pilgrims seeking guidance or healing from the quiet abbot who seemed to see with God's own eyes. But not every vision was dire. Many were gentle, even tender. Benedict often perceived the hidden virtues within his monks, the quiet patience of one brother, the deep humility of another, the growing charity in a novice who did not yet trust his own goodness. He would speak to them in ways that revealed these unseen strengths, helping each one grow with confidence in God's grace. And because he could see the earliest stirrings of temptation, he corrected with love rather than severity, offering warnings before missteps became wounds. His monks grew under his guidance like trees planted beside streams, steadily, quietly, rooted in nourishment they could not always see but constantly received. It was during this season of deepened spiritual fatherhood that Benedict encountered a new trial, one not of envy like Florentius, nor of temptation, nor of physical danger, but one that struck at the heart of his identity as a shepherd. A loyal monk named Theophilus, gentle but sensitive, began struggling with interior darkness. He feared he was unworthy of the monastic life, unfit for the discipline and prayer the rule demanded. His self-doubt grew into despair, and though he hid it well, Benedict perceived the turmoil within him. One night, in a vision, Benedict saw Theophilus standing on a precipice, not physically but spiritually, caught between surrender to God and surrender to despair. The next morning, Benedict called the monk to him with unusual urgency. He placed his hands on Theophilus's shoulders and looked into his eyes with such tenderness that the monk began to weep. Benedict told him that despair never comes from God, that even the weakest soul is precious in his sight, that humility is not self-rejection, but an honest recognition of one's need for grace. Then Benedict prayed over him, and in that moment Theophilus felt a weight lift from his heart, a heaviness break like a storm finally passing. He later said that Benedict's prayer had reached into the very place where the darkness had lodged itself, and light poured in like the dawn. From that day on, Theophilus became one of the monastery's strongest brothers, known not for perfection but for deep trust. These quiet acts of spiritual healing shaped Monte Cassino even more profoundly than Benedict's more visible miracles. The monks came to see their abbot not merely as a leader, but as a spiritual father who carried each of them in his heart. They trusted him with joys and sorrows alike, and Benedict, for his part, loved them with a tenderness that only deepened as the years passed. He prayed for them constantly, sometimes through the night, asking God to strengthen the weak, uplift the sorrowful, purify the proud, protect the vulnerable, and prepare each soul for the journey toward eternity. It was around this time that a new story emerged, one that revealed Benedict's gifts in an unexpected way. A monk named Agrippinus, troubled by long-standing bitterness, tried to hide his resentment behind silence and discipline. But resentment cannot be hidden from a heart so attuned to God. Benedict approached him one day during work in the vineyard, placed his hand upon the monk's back, and simply asked, "My son, whom do you need to forgive?" Agrippinus fell to the ground in tears, naming a wound he had kept buried for years. Benedict lifted him gently and prayed, asking God to break the chains of anger. When Agrippinus rose, he felt a freedom he had not known since childhood. He later said that the moment Benedict touched him, it was as though a stone he had carried for decades had dissolved. As these stories spread, the monastery became a magnet, not only for the devout, but also for the desperate, the weary, the broken. People climbed the mountain hoping for a word, a blessing, even a moment of peace. And Benedict welcomed each one. Some he healed with prayer, others he healed with listening. Still others he healed simply by being present, his silence carrying more compassion than many sermons could hold. Through all this, Benedict remained profoundly humble. The more his fame grew, the more he shrank into simplicity. He took no credit for miracles, no pride in visions, no pleasure in admiration. Everything he did, he offered back to God, like a child carrying shells to the shore and placing them quietly at his Father's feet. And as this chapter comes to rest like evening light settling upon the mountain, we pause and wonder, how does a soul become so transparent to God that others see not the man, but the mercy shining through him? And so, as Benedict's visions and miracles unfold gently across the fabric of daily monastic life, shaping his community with the tenderness of a shepherd attuned to every tremor of a soul, we come now into a chapter where his fatherhood stretches beyond the boundaries of Monte Cassino, embracing the powerful and the poor alike, reminding each heart that holiness does not rise in isolation, but radiates outward like a quiet flame, guiding those lost in the winds of uncertainty. In the years that followed, Benedict's name began to drift further across Italy, carried not by loud acclaim but by the whispered gratitude of those who had found peace through his counsel. Farmers spoke of the holy man who prayed for their fields and brought rain during drought. Mothers spoke of the comfort he offered when children fell ill. Travelers recounted how he welcomed them with the warmth of a familiar friend, offering bread, shelter, and prayer without ever asking for anything in return. And nobles, those far from the mountain but close to the tremors of political upheaval, began hearing reports of a spiritual father whose wisdom seemed untouched by ambition, whose words carried the weight of truth, spoken with humility. One such noble was Totila, the Ostrogothic king whose name inspired fear across Italy during an era marked by turmoil and shifting power. Totila, though a strong ruler, was known for ruthlessness and cunning. Stories of his victories spread quickly, stories of his cruelty spread even faster. Yet even a man hardened by war feels the restless tug of his conscience. And in time, Totila heard of Benedict's visions, miracles, and deep holiness. Perhaps he dismissed them at first. Perhaps he doubted that one man, perched upon a mountain, could wield such spiritual strength. But unease began gnawing at him, an unease he could not quiet with armies or strategies. And so, curious and cautious, Totila decided to test the holiness of Benedict. He sent a trusted officer, Eutharic, disguised in royal garments. Eutharic, obedient to the scheme, set out for Monte Cassino with an escort, hoping to deceive the holy abbot by presenting himself as the king. But as the group approached the monastery gates, Benedict stood waiting for them, his expression still and serene. Without hesitation, he called out, "Remove your cloak, my son. It is not yours to wear." The officer froze. His face drained of color as he realized that Benedict had seen through the disguise immediately, without inquiry, without doubt. The soldiers who accompanied him felt a chill settle over them, something deeper than fear, something like awe. Eutharic removed the cloak and fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the holiness before him. The officers returned to Totila with the story, and the king, shaken by what he heard, resolved to visit Benedict in person. When Totila arrived at Monte Cassino, he came not as a proud conqueror, but as a man humbled by a truth he could no longer deny. Benedict did not bow before the king. Instead, Totila bowed before Benedict, kneeling in reverence not to a man, but to the presence of God shining through him. Benedict spoke to Totila with firm yet compassionate words, warning him that although he would indeed achieve great victories, his power would not endure. He foretold the king's future with such clarity that Totila trembled. Yet even in prophecy, Benedict's purpose was not to instill fear, but to awaken conscience. He urged Totila to temper his cruelty with mercy, reminding him that a king's strength lies not only in conquest, but in justice, compassion, and humility. Totila left Monte Cassino a changed man, gentler, more restrained, more aware that the eyes of God watch over every action. And for a time, those around him noticed the difference. His judgments softened, his punishments grew measured, and the echoes of Benedict's counsel lingered in his decisions. This moment marked a profound truth in Benedict's life, that holiness, though rooted in solitude, inevitably radiates outward. His influence touched kings and commoners alike. His words shaped lives far beyond the quiet stone walls of his monastery. He had no desire for political power, no longing for recognition, yet God placed into his hands the hearts of men who held nations in their grasp. The monastery, once a humble refuge for a handful of monks, now became a place where even the powerful came seeking light. Yet amid these encounters, Benedict remained fully devoted to the daily care of his community. He continued walking with his monks through struggles, victories, and temptations. He prayed for them by name, spoke to them with the gentleness of a patient father, and corrected them with love. Many of the brothers had grown with him from their youth. Others had joined later, drawn by stories of peace on the mountain. But all of them felt deeply the imprint of Benedict's presence in their lives. One day, while the monks were tending their gardens, Benedict observed two young brothers engaged in a heated argument. Their voices rose sharply, breaking the silence that normally blanketed the fields. Benedict approached quietly and placed a hand on each of their shoulders. He did not reprimand them, nor did he demand explanations. Instead, he spoke softly about the necessity of peace, reminding them that anger places stones between the heart and God. His words, simple yet profound, melted the tension. The brothers embraced, and their reconciliation became a lesson the entire community reflected upon for days. For Benedict, unity was not merely an ideal, it was the heartbeat of monastic life. He believed that discord, even in brief moments, disrupted the harmony through which the soul hears God's whisper, and so he tended to peace within the community as vigilantly as gardeners tend to seedlings. Despite the profound serenity that filled Monte Cassino, Benedict never forgot the fragile nature of human hearts. He knew that even the holiest communities could face storms. One such storm arrived when a young monk, overwhelmed by the discipline of monastic life, fled the mountain under cover of night. Benedict, upon discovering his disappearance, prayed briefly, then sent 2 monks after him. They found the young brother exhausted and ashamed, sitting beside a river where he had collapsed from despair. The monks gently brought him back to the mountain, where Benedict welcomed him not with rebuke, but with embrace. He reminded the brother that God's mercy does not abandon the weak, it pursues them. The young monk wept and remained faithful the rest of his life, transformed by the compassion that met him precisely where he had fallen. These stories became the quiet tapestry of Benedict's later years, threads of mercy, vision, healing, warning, and guidance woven gently through the daily life of the monastery. Yet even as his influence grew, Benedict's own body began to feel the weight of age. His steps, once firm, became slower. His hands, once strong, began to tremble. He spent more time in prayer, less time in labor, though his spirit remained as luminous and steady as ever. The monks sensed that a new season was approaching, though none wished to speak of it. And in those last years, Benedict's holiness deepened into something almost translucent. He often spent long hours in the chapel alone, kneeling before the altar, absorbed in a union with God that surpassed words. Some monks who passed by the chapel at night claimed they saw a soft light surrounding him, like the glow of a candle shielded gently from the wind. Others said his face appeared peaceful in a way that made them feel reverence, simply to look upon him. If Benedict noticed these things, he said nothing. He remained humble, grounded, human. Yet the community knew. Benedict was already half in heaven, even as his feet still touched the stones of Monte Cassino. And as this chapter settles into a soft hush, we pause again and wonder, how does God prepare a soul for its final journey, not by withdrawing it from the world, but by filling it so fully with love that heaven feels like the natural next breath? And so, as Benedict's twilight years unfold beneath the quiet sky of Monte Cassino, and the signs of heaven's nearness begin to shimmer gently through the veil of his earthly life, we move now into the final chapter of his journey, a chapter not of decline, but of consummation, where the seeds he planted in prayer and humility blossom into a legacy that will outlive empires and shape the soul of a world he would never see. The final season of Benedict's life came with a softness that surprised even those closest to him. It did not arrive with sudden frailty or sharp decline, but with a gradual lightening, as though the weight of his earthly years had begun lifting gently from his shoulders. The monks noticed subtle changes first. His steps grew slower, though never uncertain. His gaze, always calm, seemed to look beyond the present moment, as if he could see realities the brothers could only sense dimly. His voice softened into a whisper at times, yet whenever he spoke, each word carried more warmth than ever before. It was as though the grace he had spent a lifetime cultivating had settled over him like a mantle woven of prayer, forgiveness, and peace. Despite the wear of age, Benedict did not withdraw from his community. If anything, he became even more present to his monks. He walked with them through the gardens, leaning sometimes on Morris or another faithful brother. He blessed the tools in the workshops, ran his hands across the smooth stone of the newly built walls, and visited the novices as they practiced chanting the Psalms. In each encounter, he seemed to leave behind a quiet imprint, a kind of luminous tenderness that lingered long after he passed by. The brothers felt it. They often spoke in hushed tones about how being near Benedict in these final years felt like standing beside a warm ember in the cold, a presence that comforted, steadied, and stirred devotion without demanding anything. There were moments, too, when Benedict's union with God revealed itself in ways even more profound. During prayer, some monks observed him lifted slightly above the ground, not dramatically, not in spectacle, but as though his spirit, in reaching toward heaven, softened the pull of the earth upon him. At times, he seemed unaware of the world around him during these moments, completely absorbed in communion with the one he had sought in every breath since his youth. The brothers who witnessed these quiet levitations did not speak of them without trembling, not because they feared Benedict, but because they understood they were witnessing holiness in its purest form, a soul so given to God that even nature bowed gently in acknowledgement. And yet, Benedict remained profoundly human. He ate with his brothers, though little. He listened to their confessions with the same patient heart he had carried since his earliest days as abbot. He comforted those who struggled, reminding them that holiness was not perfection, but perseverance. When illness came to the community, he visited each sick brother personally, offering prayer, cooling fevered brows, and whispering words that brought peace, even when healing did not come. In these moments, the monks saw not a man weakened by age, but a father whose love had only deepened over time. It was during these serene final years that Benedict experienced one of his most striking visions, a vision witnessed simultaneously by several of his monks. One night, while the brothers slept deeply, Benedict awoke suddenly. A strange brightness filled his cell, not harsh or startling, but warm and steady. As he rose, the light intensified until it seemed the entire world had been gathered into a single, radiant flame. Later, Benedict would say that in that light he saw the whole of creation, every hill and river, every city, every soul, held together by the love of God, shimmering like a tapestry woven from eternity. The monks who happened to be awake at that hour saw the glow spilling from beneath Benedict's door and fell to their knees, sensing a divine presence too mighty to approach. When the vision concluded, Benedict sank to the floor, overwhelmed not by fear, but by awe. He understood then, more deeply than ever before, how small the world is when held in God's hands, and how vast God's mercy is when poured out upon it. But even as his spirit soared with these glimpses of divine beauty, Benedict's body began to prepare for its own final offering. His strength waned gently. He required assistance to climb the steps of the chapel. His voice grew softer, sometimes fading altogether as he neared the end of long prayers. The monks, watching him with love, felt a mixture of sadness and reverence. They saw in him a man returning home, slowly, peacefully, like a pilgrim approaching the gates of the city he had longed for since childhood. Benedict sensed his death approaching, not with dread, but with a quiet certainty. He did not announce it immediately. Instead, he began speaking more often about heaven, about the joy of meeting Christ face to face, about the peace that comes when a soul finally rests in God. He reminded the monks that death is not an ending for the faithful, but the fulfillment of every longing the human heart carries. And he urged them to persevere, not in dramatic feats, but in the simple daily faithfulness that had shaped their lives under the rule. One morning, after a night of unusually deep prayer, Benedict called for two brothers, those who had long served at his side. He told them gently that the time had come for him to return to God. The monks, though prepared in spirit, felt their hearts tremble. They helped him rise, clothed him in simple linen, and supported him as he walked slowly toward the chapel. The sun had just risen, casting a golden glow across the stone floors. Benedict moved with dignity, though his strength was nearly gone. When he entered the chapel, the brothers who were already there gasped softly. It seemed to them that Benedict was shining, not with the brilliance of fire, but with the soft radiance of dawn. He asked to receive the Eucharist. the bread that had sustained him through every trial, every miracle, every moment of his long pilgrimage. The brothers brought the sacred host to him, and Benedict consumed it with a devotion so profound that some monks began to weep. Then, with the last of his strength, Benedict raised his hands in prayer. He did not sit or lie down. He stood, upheld by the arms of the brothers beside him, facing the altar, his heart lifted toward the God he had loved with unwavering fidelity. And in that posture, standing like a servant ready to answer his master's call, Benedict breathed his last. His face became serene, as though he had simply stepped into another room. The monks who held him felt his spirit pass not with terror or struggle, but like a candle flame gently extinguished by the softest breath. They laid him upon the chapel floor, surrounding him with prayer and tears, the silence broken only by the soft rustling of robes and the trembling psalms whispered through their grief. News of Benedict's passing spread quickly, carried by monks, travelers, and villagers who had loved him. Yet even in death, Benedict remained humble. He was not placed in a grand tomb, but in a simple grave near the altar of the chapel he had built, beside the remains of his beloved sister, Scholastica, who had preceded him in death by only a short time. It was fitting that the two who had shared a life of faith should rest side by side, awaiting the resurrection in the place where they had offered their lives to God. In the years that followed, Monte Cassino would face destruction, rebuilding, war, fire, and renewal. Yet the legacy of Benedict did not lie in stone. It lived in his rule, in the hearts of his monks, in the quiet transformation he brought to countless souls. His vision of balanced, humble, prayerful life would shape monasticism for centuries, preserve learning through tumultuous ages, and influence the very foundations of Western civilization. Long after kingdoms fell, Benedict's light continued to burn. And as this final chapter settles softly upon us, we pause and reflect. What greater miracle is there than a life so deeply rooted in God that even in death it continues to guide the world toward peace,